Me, and we are super excited to present to you today on the topics of NRCS and sponsor responsibilities for our watershed programs. We will be talking about 3 programs today. The first one, which they kind of mentioned already, the Watershed and Flood Prevention Operations Program, which you may hear me say Watershed Ops. Or watershed operations. We also will talk about the watershed rehabilitation program, which we call rehab. It's kind of funny when I get calls from people and they say, "So you're in rehab, right?" I'm always like, yeah, I'm in the rehab program. And then Jean's favorite program, Emergency Watershed Protection Program, or EWP, which honestly, when I was out in the field, was one of my favorite programs too. But that's not the one that I'm the coordinator for. So moving right along. Yes. So the first program, not necessarily the best one, but Sonia may think so. The Watershed Ops Program. So this program it's a watershed planning on a whole watershed scale. So this program provides technical and financial assistance to state, local governments, and tribal organizations, or the sponsors, to help plan and implement authorized watershed projects. And through this program, we have several purposes. And those purposes are flood prevention, watershed protection, public recreation, public fish and wildlife, agricultural water management, municipal and industrial water supply, and water quality management. So the cost share rate for these purposes varies anywhere from 50 to 100%, depending on that purpose. These watershed projects could consist of a combination of structures such as flood control dams or levees, conservation practices like terraces, grass waterways, grade stabilization structures, animal waste facilities or aquatic species crossings. Could even have measures that can also involve the conversion of open channel irrigation canals to pressurized pipelines, or even the refurbishment of culverts and road stream crossings to improve the passage of aquatic species. So we've actually toured some really neat aquatic species passage projects in Massachusetts. I think there's also some in Maine. So if that's something that you all are interested in looking at for a watershed project, then those would be some states that would be good to contact. Next, the program that Bronson and I work with daily is rehab. So rehab provides technical and financial assistance to rehabilitate and extend the service life of dams that were originally constructed with assistance through NRCS watershed programs. So we cannot rehabilitate dams that were just built by a landowner, a single landowner. It has to have been built through the watershed program funding. So that's very important. We get that question a lot. So since 1948, NRCS has assisted local sponsors in constructing over 11,850 dams. These dams have a lot of these dams. I don't have the number. Used to have a number by year of how many dams have exceeded their life, but many of these have reached the end of their design life and are potentially hazardous to life and property downstream if they were to fail. And so those dams that are considered high hazard now because they have a lot of properties downstream, and if they were to fail, could cause damage. Those are the dams that are the priority for the rehab program. So these dams are owned and operated and maintained by sponsors or tribal, state, and local units of government. They provide over $2.4 billion in annual benefits to communities across the nation. These dams provide water supply for agriculture and communities. They help protect communities against flooding. They provide recreational opportunities and provide habitat for fish and wildlife. It's a pretty cool program. Next, my favorite when I was out in Oklahoma, so the national office was EWP. So EWP assists sponsors in implementing emergency recovery measures when you have a major disaster, a natural disaster. And so when you have flooding or tornadoes, hurricanes, fires, ice storms, earthquakes, droughts, windstorms, this is the program that I want to say is for you. But when you have natural disasters like that, and you have projects that might be like some of the projects that we do are stream bank stabilization or debris removal. Those are two really big ones with EWP. They even do some buyouts now, but I'm not going to get into that because that could be a whole several day presentation. But anyways, if you have county commissioners who know of projects that could be EWP after you have a natural disaster, this is the program to go visit with your local conservation district or local NRCS office about. The cost share rate for EWP is up to 75% NRCS or federal. And then if for limited resource areas, it can be up to 90% NRCS. And that just reminded me that I did not say what the cost share rate was for rehab. For the rehab program, it is 65% federal and 35% local sponsors. Sorry about that. I did miss that. We did have some questions about funding that came in when people registered. So we just wanted to flash this slide up. This is the funding that had been appropriated in millions since 2018 to the 3 watershed programs. We did have a lot of money that was appropriated in 2022, and this was a bipartisan infrastructure law funding. And so we were able to fund a lot of new phases in watershed ops and in rehab with that BIL funding. So if you hear us talk about BIL, it's the bipartisan infrastructure law funding. We have also had questions come in about what funding maybe we're going to get this fiscal year, or what the outlook for the funding is. And we really don't know at this time what the outlook will be with the new administration, but they are still negotiating the Farm Bill. So we don't know for sure what our Farm Bill funding amounts will be for this fiscal year yet. So how do sponsors request assistance for rehab and the Watershed Operations Program? The sponsors must request assistance in writing. So it's just writing a letter to your NRCS state conservationists. We do have limited funding at this time for the rehabilitation program and watershed ops. We are funding additional funding requests for current projects first at this time. That's the priority, to make sure that our projects can continue being worked on. So say you have a watershed plan that's being worked on, and at some point you need additional money for that planning. That will be our priority over funding a new phase. So when we are ready to fund new phases, they will be funded in the priority order of construction, then design, then planning, because we want to make sure we get these projects through the whole process as quickly as we can. Let's see. There is currently a wait list for new phases for rehab and watershed ops. And I know for rehab, we are going to start looking at ranking and funding the new phases as funding will allow in March. For EWP, requesting assistance is a little bit different for EWP. So let's see, sponsors must submit a formal request for assistance to the NRCS state conservationists within 60 days of the disaster occurrence. So that's within 60 days of that flooding event, that big rain event, or the fire, or whatever that natural disaster is, or 60 days from when access to the sites become available. So if you have a major rainfall event and you have flooding and you're not able to get out and actually see if you might have some EWP projects out there for over 60 days, you're still going to be okay because you were able to even get out there and look at them yet. What's a little bit different about this letter of request is that there is a template letter that we need the sponsors to use. This letter was developed to make sure that all the program requirements are addressed in the request. So your NRCS point of contact or your local NRCS field office will be able to assist you with this formal request. So if your county commissioners had flooding and they have roads that have erosion or debris clogging bridges or anything like that, that could be an EWP project, it would be good for them to contact their local NRCS field office before submitting the letter. And some of the things that are going to be in that letter is they want to make sure that at a minimum that the letter documents the sponsor's eligibility. So the sponsor understands their responsibilities, contributing their costs, their responsibilities of contributing their share of the costs as determined by NRCS, by providing funds or eligible services necessary to undertake activities, making sure that they're able to obtain any necessary real property rights or permits that are needed, that they are agreeing to provide any required operation and maintenance of completed emergency measures. Includes information pertaining to that natural disaster. So when did the disaster occur? Where did it occur at? What is the scope of the problems and the assistance that's needed out there? It will also have in there documenting that the sponsors have exhausted or have insufficient funding or other resources available to provide adequate relief from applicable hazards. Let's see. And acknowledge that NRCS will not provide funding for activities that the sponsors complete prior to signing an agreement. So we're not going to reimburse a sponsor for something that they have fixed prior to an agreement, an EWP agreement with NRCS. Okay. Eligible sponsors and responsibilities. So eligible sponsors include state governments, political subdivision of state, qualified Indian tribe or tribal organizations, and a unit of local government. Okay, so this one is going to be packed full of all kinds of information. This is a long one. So, sponsors' responsibilities. At least one sponsor must have the power of eminent domain and be willing to use it as necessary. Something new that has come about, though, is this requirement does not apply to Indian tribes or tribal organizations. The sponsor must acquire real property and water, mineral, and other real property rights, needed for the project. This is not required for projects where all works of improvement are to be installed by land treatment long-term contracts. Sponsors are responsible for permits and licenses. Permits and licenses are not cost share. They're not cost shareable. That's something else to remember. They must have, at least one of the sponsors must have and exercise the authority to levy taxes or provide another adequate means of financing the local share of their project costs, as well as the cost for operating and maintaining the practices. Land treatment above reservoirs. We've kind of changed that to land treatment upstream of reservoirs because, as my coworkers say, above means in the sky. So land treatment upstream of reservoirs. Now, what this is the sponsors must obtain agreements from landowners to implement soil conservation plans on not less than 50% of the land situated in the drainage area upstream of each retention reservoir that's installed with watershed program funds. So if a watershed dam is one of the practices in the watershed project plan, and sedimentation could be an issue. The reason we want them to get these conservation plans on 50% of the land upstream is so that there isn't major sedimentation issues. It's going to contribute to the failure or filling up these reservoirs with sediment in quicker than that's supposed to happen. So that's really important. One thing that has changed about that is for rehab, we don't require that unless sedimentation is an issue. Then we want to make sure that the sponsors have addressed that sedimentation issue upstream before rehabilitating a structure, because it's just going to fill up with sediment really quickly again. Public participation is a big one. The sponsor must arrange for and carry out activities that encourage the public to participate in the watershed project planning process. The financial part of it, again, the sponsors have to show evidence of commitment for funding, installing, operating, and maintaining their projects. The sponsors will also perform all contracting for construction of any structure except for if they request that NRCS do the contracting. And Bronson is going to talk more about contracting later, locally led contracts and federal contracting for construction. Watershed management. The sponsors must implement the needed watershed management features, such as providing land treatment upstream for watershed protection, obtaining needed permits and easements, and assuring compliance with floodplain zoning and national flood insurance program regulations and other land use regulations. And operation, maintenance, and replacement. The sponsor must use its power and authority to ensure the installation, operation, maintenance, and replacement of the project as planned. So we're going to talk a little bit more about land rights. So the sponsors must obtain the land rights before solicitation for an EWP project, and they must obtain those land rights before requesting funding for construction for watershed ops and rehab. We've had a lot of projects in the past, or some projects where we have funded more than one phase, or maybe we've funded planning through construction, and then they get to construction, and sometimes they get tied up in land rights lawsuits and things, and that money just sits there for a lot of years. So we just want to make sure that land rights and permitting are obtained and ready before we give out money for the construction phase now. Need to make sure that those land rights are adequate to perform the work, including ingress and egress and your operation and maintenance. And the sponsors accept all financial and other responsibility for failures to obtain adequate land and water rights. Sponsors are responsible for utility relocation, so they must arrange for and pay for the necessary location, removal, or relocation of utilities. And the cost for this does not qualify for cost share, so that will be completely on the sponsor. So throughout the presentation, we have scattered in some of the questions that came in from participants. So this is one, and this one comes with a disclaimer. Bronson and I are not land rights acquisition experts, but I did talk to a counsel for one of our sponsors who does deal with this, and she gave me some good information. So we just wanted to share this. The question is, what types of instruments are recorded or put in place when real property rights are obtained for a watershed project? So easements might be one of them. These are explicitly granted in writing. So like an express easement is expressed in writing and recorded at the courthouse. A prescriptive easement, the definition is these arise when a party claims title adversely asserting ownership through continuous and open use of the property. So Bronson kind of gave me an example as maybe they have a fence line, or what do you say, a canal? Irrigation canal or something like that they've been using, but it isn't exactly an easement in writing. It's more like a prescriptive easement. And then an easement by implication. So this is implied when a landowner once owned adjacent tracts of land. Maybe they sell a tract and then they still own a tract in there that's landlocked. So they have an easement by implication or necessity to cross that other landowner's property to get to their property, because that's the only way they can get to it. And then this is continuation from that question. Another instrument is a deed. Deed and other instruments can be used to convey property rights. There are general warranty deeds, which are often used in real estate. There are special warranty deeds, more common in commercial transactions. Deed restrictions. These are specific conditions or limitations placed on property use that are recorded in the deed to ensure compliance with those project objectives. And then settlement agreements. While these are not recorded like traditional easements or deeds, these agreements can establish valid easement rights or other land use conditions. So there you go. Okay. Now this one, we're going to talk about in-kind contributions. And we weren't really sure where this fit into the presentation, but we wanted to make sure that we talked about it. And since we've been talking about land rights acquisition, we thought this would be a good place to put this because it's important. Okay, so this is how I'm going to explain it. I'm going to use a rehab project as an example. So for a rehab project or rehabilitating a dam, the cost share is 65% federal and 35% local sponsors. Now, the sponsors can have in-kind contributions toward their 35% cost share. So what that might be is if the sponsors are out acquiring land rights, then they want to be credited for their land rights towards their 35% cost share. So that's an in-kind credit. Now, something that's really important to remember is before a sponsor can be credited for that in-kind contribution, they have to sign an MOU, which is a Memorandum of Understanding with NRCS, and it must be signed and executed. And so whenever I worked in the state, whenever we would finish a rehabilitation plan, the day that the sponsors were signing the agreement, I would also have an MOU drafted. And within that MOU, I would have estimated costs of land rights or any other costs that they thought that they would incur that could be credited towards their share of the rehab project, and make sure that those costs were in that MOU and they would sign it at the same time that they signed their watershed plan. So that's one way to do it. A couple of things about in-kind contributions, though. So in no case will the amount of in-kind contribution exceed the sponsor's share of the cost for works of improvement. I'm going to give some examples of these in just a second. The maximum cost eligible for in-kind credit is the same as that for cost sharing. The sponsors will receive no cash reimbursement for in-kind contribution. So we're not going to reimburse, like if you acquire some land rights, we're not going to reimburse you for those land rights. It can only be credited towards your cost share. And then the value allowed is an in-kind contribution for real property acquired by the sponsor by means other than donation cannot exceed the sponsor's actual cost. So as Bronson we were visiting about this, and I guess an example of some of these may be, say your land rights that you acquired was valued at $400,000, but you only had to pay $100,000. We can only credit you for your actual cost. So we can only credit you for that $100,000. The other thing is we can't give you credit for a cost you incurred if it's not eligible for cost share. So that would be like permitting. It's not eligible for cost sharing, so we can't give you credit for that, even though it was an expense that you had towards this project. Okay, I hope that's clear. I hope it's clear. Okay, permitting. So again, the sponsors must secure all permits. They have to confirm that all federal, state, and local permits have been applied for and received. All costs relative to obtaining required permits, complying with permit special conditions, and permit reports will be borne by the sponsor. And the sponsors accept all financial and other responsibility for failures to obtain adequate permits. So the sponsors will be liable if they do not have the permits that are needed for the project. Operation and maintenance. So operation and maintenance is required and is when it's needed for a project to serve its intended purpose, and when it's needed to ensure that it will not become hazardous. So that's like in the case of a watershed dam. Want to make sure that sponsors are doing their operation and maintenance out there so that there isn't a chance that you're going to have some like major erosion or something and that dam is going to fail and cause a lot of damage downstream or something like that. The sponsor's responsibility for operation and maintenance and replacement begins when a structure is determined to be complete by NRCS. So if this pertains to your project, during the vegetation establishment period following construction, the sponsor must perform maintenance to ensure adequate vegetation establishment. However, if we're in a major drought condition, you plant the vegetation and it doesn't rain, it's a drought, NRCS can come back in and provide funding to plant that vegetation again because the deficiencies are due to a natural cause. So, I mean, that's a good thing. The NRCS can do that. Following the vegetation establishment period, the state con must notify the sponsor by letter that the vegetative cover is performing as designed, and will also remind the sponsor of its responsibility to continue the obligations of operation and maintenance, of their operation and maintenance agreement through the evaluated life of the project. That operation and maintenance obligation continues until the measure reaches its evaluated life. So for a watershed dam, for instance, a lot of those evaluated life, it's also been known to be called design life or a service life, are usually 50 to 100 years. Let's see. So the state con will also remind the sponsor in writing that the sponsor may have continued operation maintenance responsibilities and to stay compliant with other federal and local laws throughout the life of the project. So operation and maintenance agreements, these agreements are put in place and identify those sponsors' O&M requirements. So it lists what those requirements are. Some of the operation and maintenance agreements that are in place do not have a specified end date. We found out we get a lot of questions about that. You know, my agreement doesn't say when this ends, and it should use the evaluated life of that specific watershed, or that specific project. Sorry. So if it doesn't have it in the agreement, you can go back to the original watershed plan, and you should be able to find what that evaluated life is. And a lot of the times on the watershed dams, it's usually 50 years. And if you don't find it in the narrative of the plan, a lot of times you can find it in a footnote of one of the economics tables. It'll say evaluated for a 50-year life or evaluated for a 100-year life, and then you know what that is. NRCS, another thing I wanted to say, sorry. If there is no date specified and you cannot find it in the plan anywhere, then NRCS will assume 50 years life from the date of construction for that project. NRCS does continue to provide informal dam inspections at the request of the sponsor for dams that have exceeded their design life. I think that's a question that we had from some of the participants. Yeah, at the request of the sponsor. Sorry. I think that's my next slide. Yeah, sorry about that. So does NRCS continue to provide informal dam inspections at the request of the sponsor for dams that have exceeded their life expectancy? And the answer is yes. We do continue to provide technical assistance if you request it and you are the sponsor. Another thing is, in order to remain eligible for the Watershed Rehabilitation Program, operation and maintenance must be up to date on watershed dams. Okay. I think this would be a good time for questions. Questions. Before we switch over to Bronson.
Oh, that sounds good. April, you've covered a giant amount of information in a short period of time. We so appreciate you and Bronson joining us. Let's start with the first question. I'll take them in the way that they came in. Is there a requirement for new dams to be built out of a more environmentally friendly materials that will last longer and have fish ladders or passages or this type of environmental friendly design?
I think that could be included whenever they're doing their new watershed project plan, is to include things like that and practices like that. Not only that watershed dam practice, but also those practices, you think? Sorry, I don't know if you can see Bronson.
Yeah, screen.
We'll do this together.
There we go.
Yeah, so I think also, working with your permitting agencies and cooperating agencies like the Fish and Wildlife Service and the other permitting agencies, that folks will look for those type of adjustments, whether it's fish passage or fish screening, to keep fish out of, if we have irrigation diversions that are going in. A lot of times we're installing fish screens on those structures to prevent fish from becoming entrapped in irrigation canals or irrigation systems, that just lead to fields instead of water. So I think those are all good things. We strive to use the best technology that's out there and to be environmentally friendly. So.
All right, thank you. Let's take on another question for EWP, for the Emergency Watershed Program. Is there a requirement for a state or federal disaster declaration to be eligible even to apply and to start the process?
You can apply without a presidential declaration now, can't you?
Yeah,
this
if
is-
you.
Oh, do we have to have a state conservationist declaration
Yes.
anymore?
Yes.
Yeah, so you can have a state conservationist declaration, not
Okay.
just a presidential declaration.
So it doesn't have to be necessarily the state or federal, but it could be a state conservationist of the Natural Resource Conservation Service.
Yeah, and those disasters that are non-presidentially declared, the state conservationist declares the disaster and authorizes the assistance at that level instead of a presidentially declared disaster.
Yes,
It reminds me, always befriend that state conservationist in some manner.
I know.
Be careful about the criticism that you may want to give to the state NRCS office, because you might need them the next event that comes through, and you might need them to declare a disaster and help you with the project application and the other things. So just a plug for our state conservationists out there. They don't get enough love, it doesn't seem like. So they get a lot of issues, but not a lot of love. Okay, they can declare the natural disaster. It doesn't have to be a governor or the president or anyone. It can be, but it doesn't have to be in order to.
Yes,
Correct.
it can be, but does not have to be.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So you spoke about this, and this is very timely, April. You were right on top of this. Next question, which is who is responsible for the operation and maintenance after the evaluated life or design life? Typically 50, 100 years, whatever that design life is, we reach the end of that. We reach the end of our project responsibilities and whatnot. Where does it go from there? Who? Just your thoughts. I know there may not be a specific answer for this, but your thoughts on this.
I think it's still important for those sponsors to continue to operate and maintain them. I mean, especially for a watershed dam, right?
Yeah, those practices until they're removed, right? A watershed dam, often your regulators will, your state dam safety regulators or other regulating agencies. It depends on the state that you're in. But most states have a dam safety program in the state, and those regulators are there to make sure that those practices are still maintained in perpetuity, because until a practice like that is removed, there's a certain hazard to that practice if it's not operated and maintained correctly. So,
and for the dams, I mean, they're still providing flood prevention benefits, and they may still be providing water supply benefits.
Well, the same thing goes for the practices like an irrigation diversion or an irrigation pipeline, right? That practice is still serving the farmers and ranchers that receive water through those systems, or if it's a system of levees, for example, as well, providing flood protection to certain areas, even well after the service life or the evaluated life of the practice is, and essentially we've realized the federal benefits from our investment. Well, those benefits still continue on into the future. And so there's a benefit to continuing to operate and maintain that infrastructure that's been installed, honestly, until some of it's removed, because it's permanent infrastructure that's changed the natural environment to where there can be harm to others if it's not operated and maintained correctly.
I have a little bit of an encouragement here as a field representative for a state conservation agency working with conservation districts throughout the state I served. I would always encourage my conservation district boards that I work with to understand what structures they sponsored. And I would give the same information to irrigation districts or municipalities or cities or counties or whoever. Know what structures you sponsored, because of that long-term kind of relationship that you may need to have with those structures. Plus, I always remind the folks that there is amount of liability in regards to if a structure that they sponsored just happens to not go well. And so being able to make sure that you've got the liability coverage for that's important too. Any thoughts about that? Just kind of following up on your, watch them always, be aware, know what's there, what's going on.
Yes, that's wonderful. And we encourage other people to do the same, because I mean, even, making sure that the sponsors' easements that they have out there are monitored, and making sure that people, I keep referring to watershed dams because we're in rehab, but making sure that people aren't building houses and spillways and
Yeah.
plowing up spillways for gardens and things like that, which Bronson's going to talk more about that. But yeah, it's important for sponsors to know those structures they have responsibilities for. And then it's also important for people in the communities to know that they're there.
Yeah.
Even the watershed dams, they've been referred to as silent sentinels because people don't know that they're there protecting them. They're downstream of them and they have no idea that they're there. So that teaching people about those practices is very important.
A quick bite here is that you can get help from the State Conservation Office of NRCS. You can get help sometimes from the dam safety group in your state, that keeps the records of all this and who sponsored the various structures and things. There are places that you can get help. So it's not like you have to fly blind, right? Or go out and do complete air traffic around all of your county. You can at least get a list anyway to get you started. All right. The sponsorship responsibility to maintain the watershed dam after the design life. I think we answered that fully. Very good. Thank you so much. Let's talk about, there's one question here that came in that refers to really struggling with the watershed program requirements when they can't find somebody that has all the powers and can meet the sponsor responsibilities required. Some of that eminent domain you're going to speak about a little bit, and some of the things that are going on about property and long-term, requirements. Some of our conservation districts don't even have all of those from time to time, all of those requirements. Just it's a long question here, but I'm just going to squeeze it down to just your thoughts, April and Bronson, about, okay, man, we went to this outfit, they can't do it, that outfit, they can't do it, conservation district can't do it. Now where do we go? What do we do?
Yeah. That's a really good question, and I think there's reasons that Congress set the program up that way.
Yeah,
these are not just April and Bronson's suggestions for a successful project, right? And so these are written into law when they started the program. I think Congress wanted to make sure that the projects that were installed using the program were going to be maintained, we're going to be needed, we're going to be entities that were able to collect money and to operate and maintain the infrastructure that was being built into the future. And so I think those were some of the safeguards that Congress put in place. And those are the requirements of the program that Congress set up. And so, it's not just, your NRCS state conservationists being difficult or anything like that. It's the way Congress set the program up, and that's the sideboards they put on the funding that we receive in the program. And so, and I think those are safeguards in place, right? Making sure that a sponsor can bring in adequate funding to maintain and carry on into the future, because these are, in general, there are exceptions to that with certain operations, watershed operations projects that are installed, but in general, these are mostly infrastructure type projects where it's a large infrastructure and it's in the built environment, and you have to take care of things in the built environment because it's not the natural environment anymore.
Yeah.
So
I hope you got time for three more questions here. But if a potential sponsor, just cannot find the entity that can sponsor these things and have all the requirements necessary to sponsor one of these, call or write to the National Watershed Coalition folks, email to our leaders there. Find out a little bit. Oftentimes they know the contacts within that state who could help them find other potential sponsors, or built on their experience from other states where this has happened, right? Where they just couldn't find the right player. But we've got some outstanding leaders, Tina, Jean, Dr. Dan, even, if he'll come out of retirement long enough to play, sometimes he'll have the answer. And some of you notice that the answers are coming into your questions too. This is the event. This is the reason why the recording is not as good as the live event is, because we're getting some nice questions answered as we go along, and you're getting the benefit of those. Is a cost share
rate back to that question real quick?
Oh, yeah.
I think, I have a great example of one of those. We had a large irrigation diversion that one of the soil conservation districts wanted to build. And in the state I was in Utah, the conservation districts fell under the State Department of Agriculture. That's where their authority came from. And they couldn't find that local sponsor that had all those abilities to, exercise eminent domain and such. And finally, it got to the point where, the local soil conservation district board members approached the state about sponsoring the project, and the state became the sponsor because it was so important to the state that that kind of a project happened in that area for those farmers and ranchers. And so, really was a success there, where the soil conservation district board still kind of led the operation and maintenance and things, but the state actually ended up being one of the sponsors, State Department of Agriculture and Food, and worked out great. It just brought another entity to the table and more recognition, and also some additional funding that helped them build the practices that they wanted to. So I think sometimes those are a win-win, even though it takes a longer route to get to where you're going.
Yeah, and that state agency had some of those eminent domain things and some other things maybe that the conservation district didn't have as pieces of legislation or other sponsors. Great example, Bronson. Well, hey, let's look at a pretty simple question. Is the cost share rate at 65%, 35% just for construction, or is it for all three phases?
Oh, that is for construction, yes. So we do provide technical assistance for planning and design. And then that 65-35 is financial assistance for construction. So
just construction, not all three phases.
Correct, just construction. Yes, we can do the plan 100% of the planning and design.
Okay. And there could be some variations in this, right? While we're talking about the national rules and responsibilities today, state A or B, NRCS office, do they have some latitude with how they do some things too? Just a brief answer to that.
There actually is with some of the watershed operations purposes. There's provisions in those purposes. If there is another federal program that provides a different cost share rate that NRCS typically provides, then we're able to match the other agency's federal rate. And so there is a little bit of wiggle room, although for rehabilitation, for example, like the 65% is straight across the board. There's no moving that. But for some of the watershed operations program purposes, there is the ability to adjust the rate if there are other applicable federal programs that address that. So
okay, excellent. So if the sponsors pursue returning an easement to the landowner after the structure has reached its required time, and
that's my next slide, Ray. You're still in my thunder now.
We'll hold that one until the next slide. Awesome.
That one we're going to answer right next. Yeah.
And then you've got some information on in-kind contributions coming up too. So I'm going to hold that question. And Dan is answering a question that might be of interest to the two of you, which is if a landowner refuses to allow the watershed dam inspector on the site to inspect watersheds due to the watershed being on their property, that could be problematic. And I don't know whether you want to tackle that or wait till after we go over a few more slides.
Maybe we'll wait to see what Dan responds, and we'll capture it after we've gone through a few more slides.
Yeah, I want to see what Dan says.
You want to see what Dan said?
Yeah, we can't see it.
Okay, well, maybe I'll get up there. I'll look that up for you, and we'll talk about it.
Okay.
That's excellent. Dan, let's just take it on now, and then we're going to move right to your slides again. Dan said, "Try the education first." But sometimes you got to involve, it's a graduated steps that Dan is suggesting here. Sometimes the county attorney and the sheriff are the bottom line. So take the graduated steps one at a time. Don't just go right to the sheriff. Start with people that can maybe help, and education being the first thing. Dan suggests preferring a discussion between the sponsors and the reluctant landowner. And it might be the best way to get personalities, involved and get that done. I have one question I always like to ask in situations like that. What will it look like when it's working like it should? What will it look like when it's working like it should, as the opening question for a group of people that might be considering that, or a landowner that's having a tough time with the whole thing? What would it look like when it's working like it should? And sometimes what it looks like is doable, right? And if it's doable, then by all means. So Dan, thanks for that question. answered. And again, keep those questions coming in. We're going to have some of them live. We're going to have some of them answered by the Q&A area. Again, those of you that tried the hand raise, don't do that, because we're just going to put your hand down, because with several hundred people and so much to go over, we're just not going to be able to take those verbal questions as you might want. It's my pleasure to turn the program back over to Bronson. Please go ahead.